So, by the time we get to this 13th chapter, the kingdom has been split, and Jeroboam, in his lack of faith and in his disobedience of God's commandment, has set up the golden calves. Now, first story out of the gate, after all that has taken place, it's a story that probably you remember, but it's one I think in some ways we don't know much about what to do with it. And I confess, well, most all of these lessons, or lessons that I have used in a series of classes I do over at Florida College, I haven't worked this one in yet, and I keep intending to. I just haven't done that, but I think it's an extraordinarily important lesson with regard to what's going on up in the northern kingdom, and as far as revealing God's attitude towards the golden calves that they have set up there. It is the story, we usually call it just a story about the prophet who believed a lie. And the main use we make of it is it's a dangerous thing to believe a lie. And that's a good enough use right there, I suppose, but I think there's probably more to it than that. Indeed, there are some very odd things that take place here that I think challenge us to think about why God would have allowed things to happen the way they did. Begin reading with me here, 1 Kings chapter 13. It says, "Now behold, there came a man of God from Judah to Bethel. He's from the southern kingdom of Judah down there, but God sends him up to the town of Bethel. He's identified as a man of God. That's one of the designations that is used for the prophets in the Old Testament. So he's a prophet that God sends from the southern kingdom of Judah up to Bethel. Now that's not very far because that's just over the border. But it is to the place where one of those golden calves was located. And we're told that when he got there, he delivered a prophetic message. But it also is told to us that when he got there, it happened to be at the very time that King Jeroboam was there at the altar burning incense. And it says, he cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, 'O altar, altar, thus says the Lord.'" On the face of it, that might sound a little bit strange. The altar is an inanimate object. It can't do anything. But of course, while this is addressed to the altar, it is said for the benefit of those who are standing by, and that would include especially King Jeroboam, who is there burning incense, an act of worship at that sanctuary, and the one who had set it up to start with. And so he says, "O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David." Now that's the king down here in the south, down in Jerusalem, where the true temple is located. "A king shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. And he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and human bones shall be burned on you." Now that is a dreadful oracle. That is a dreadful message. He says that someday there is going to be a king, a descendant in the royal house down there in the south, and he's going to bear the name Josiah. The name Josiah itself simply means Jehovah supports him. And I don't know whether this prophet or the people who heard him or anybody else thought in terms literally of the name Josiah, or they thought justice is symbolic, then this all would be quite literally fulfilled almost 200 years later. But we're not going to be looking so much at the fulfillment tonight, just the circumstances here. He prophesies that a king by the name of Josiah would come, and he would sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you. This was going to be an altar for human sacrifice, but human sacrifices would be the very priests who ministered at just such places as this, the high places where they either worshiped other gods or worshiped God as though he were just a pagan god. And not only that, human bones shall be burned on you, according to the law of Moses. You can hardly do anything to desecrate something more than burning human bones. Your contact with a dead body made someone unclean, but to take something holy like an altar, which was supposed to be holy, which of course is not a holy altar, it's an unholy altar because it's in violation of God's commandment. But it's precisely because of that God is someday going to show the unholiness of this altar by having it be used for the human sacrifice and the burning of human bones. Well, of course, that oracle would not sit very well with the king who is standing there. At any rate, it says, "He gave a sign. This is the sign which the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be split apart, and the ashes which are on it shall be poured out." It says, "It came about when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar in Bethel, that Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, 'Seize him.'" You can just see the scene. There's this fellow that has come up. Perhaps he's worked his way into the outer fringes of the court. I don't know whether he got to come right up to the altar or whether he shouted it from the back. But here's King Jeroboam standing right up there at the altar burning incense. And of course, every eye is focused on him. Then, when this fellow starts crying out this dreadful prophecy, which of course is a condemnation of Jeroboam himself, Jeroboam, from his position, stretches out his hand and says, "Get that fellow." I always think of a rather comical situation that happened some years ago over at Florida College. We used to have chapel talks down at the riverside, and one time some students, after the religious part of the service, wanted to play a joke, so they hired someone off the street to put on a big frogman suit. And right after the chapel talk, he came running down, jumped up on the stage, and then jumped overboard and waved at everybody as he floated out to the river. President Cope was the president at the time, and according to the story, though I wasn't a witness to this because it was before my time and I was not the fellow in the suit, but he was reported to have stood up, running all the way to the water, shouting, "Get him, get him, get him." And if you can imagine, what a scene it was for a college president to jump up and shout, "Get that fellow who is here to desecrate our services here." Well, that's in a much more serious vein. You know what's taking place here? Get that fellow. Now, we're not going to tolerate such a thing as that. When he stretched out his hand, we are told that the hand that he stretched out against him dried up so that he could not draw it back to himself. It was simply paralyzed and frozen. He couldn't move it. And when the king is standing there trying to pull his hand back and can't do it, his hand is stretched out over that altar, even as the altar splits apart and the ashes come tumbling out, just as the man of God had said it. You'd think that wouldn't be a terrifying thing. And the king answered and said to the man of God, suddenly his demeanor has changed entirely. "Please entreat the Lord your God and pray for me." Jeroboam was perhaps conscious here that he had no standing at this point to pray to Yahweh. He says, "Entreat the Lord your God and pray for me that my hand may be restored to me." And so the man of God entreated the Lord, and the king's hand was restored to him. And whether it be the freezing of his hand, the drying up of his hand, or the healing of his hand, in both cases, he was forced to acknowledge that his hand was subject to the Lord's word, the hand with which he had been burning incense, the very hand with which he had issued the command for that altar to be built in Bethel. Then the king said to the man of God, notice how his attitude has changed. He said to the man of God, "Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward." He says, at one minute he's ready to have the fellow's head, and now he says, "That's all right, we can be buddies here. You come home, have dinner, and I'll pay you handsomely, give you a reward." It's kind of like, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'll respect you now." Verse 8, the man of God said to the king, "We're now told something that we hadn't been told at first." The man of God says, "Can't do it." He says, "I got some special instructions on my way before I left to come up here. The same God who told me to come up here and say this told me that I wasn't to eat or drink when I got here, and when I got ready to come home, I was supposed to go back another way." Verse 8, the man of God said, "King, if you were to give me half your house, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread or drink water in this place. For so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, you shall eat no bread, nor drink water, nor return by the way in which you came." So he went another way and did not return by the way in which he came to Bethel. And certainly he conducts himself in an entirely honorable fashion, in a fashion entirely of obedience to the Lord, because I think you can be sure that, Jeroboam would have done something very nice for this fellow, and in many ways that would have been a great temptation. How much recently it's been in the news about how much money's been raised by selling invitations to the White House. Well, this fellow's got an invitation to the king's house here, and he's going to have the king's ear and all of the advantages, but he declines. No, he has his command, and he is going to be obedient to that command. I think that's important because we learn that this prophet here is a fellow who appears to want to have done exactly what God told him to do. And so he goes by another way just as he was told to go.